company like Google DeepMind, particularly when they had decided essentially to really dive into healthcare. And so I was at Google at a point when they decided to go into healthcare with the formation of Google Health as a sort of product area, and looking at the ways that Google was looking at the problems they wanted to solve and how to actually solve those problems, then not only gave me a good foundation in terms of understanding the space and understanding the ways to build and leverage the best of technology to solve those problems, but as you could imagine, having that Google DeepMind name on my resume as well gives me a certain level of credibility, a certain level of having that experience. Then, I could bring that sort of best in class understanding to basically solve problems wherever I may go and whatever type of company that I may be at.
All right, everyone, welcome. Kwame, thanks for joining us today.
Come on.
Perfect. So I'm honestly excited to have you share your story about how you went from the medical field into the field of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And hopefully a lot of folks that are listening and are thinking about the medical field will get a lot of lessons and hopefully some great career tips about what's going to happen. And that's for both those who are entering the field and those who are currently in the field. So super excited. I'd like to begin, tell us where you work now, what you currently do, and, why you chose to work there.
Yeah. So I'm super excited to be here. First of all, this is an amazing initiative trying to kind of, capture the stories of so many of the folks from the Caribbean diaspora who are out there in the world kind of doing big things, making change and inspiring people, everybody from the Caribbean diaspora to kind of represent. And so super excited to be part of this initiative just for that reason. So I think to start, currently I'm a senior product manager at Hinge Health. And Hinge Health is a healthcare tech startup here in Silicon Valley that is essentially building a virtual digital musculoskeletal clinic. So treating people with various aspects of musculoskeletal pain, back pain, joint pain, which actually happens to be the number one reason why people miss work, the number one spend of employers for the employee insurance. Musculoskeletal issues is the number one spend by far. And so Hinge Health is essentially the market leader in building this virtual digital clinic. And as you could imagine, because of the pandemic, because of the push of digital medicine towards these virtual telehealth type of offerings, timing was perfect. Hinge has been doing this since 2014, but they've been building for a while. And so just when the pandemic hit with this big requirement or need for virtual digital clinical care, Hinge was well positioned to essentially, I think, 6x its valuation between the beginning of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. So it's a company that's doing it big. We are currently valued at something like $3 billion, which is a massive jump. And in the healthcare space, we are by far the fastest growing health tech company. And the type of impact we have on the planet, especially starting here in the US, we have significant benefit in terms of reducing back pain, which is, like I mentioned, one of the biggest reasons why people miss work, why people have reduced productivity, why people have reduced quality of life. And so we are employing the latest in technology to help transition or help people deal with musculoskeletal pain if they already have an injury, and to prevent musculoskeletal injuries. For example, if you work in a warehouse, for example, there's a bunch of things you can be doing to prevent potential injuries if you work in a field where musculoskeletal injuries are to a high level. So that's what Hinge does overall. Specifically, I lead the product team that's building our expert medical opinion offering. And expert medical opinion is essentially a service that we provide to a company's employees to provide expert opinions on their condition and on their care. So it's sort of like a second opinion. If you already have surgery planned, we are able to look at your records, spend a lot of time with you answering your questions, and essentially be able to advise you on not just like what is the best care plan, but advise you on how to kind of think about your health. And so one of the sort of product tenants that I'm pushing for and building into what we do is that in a lot of medicine, there's this sort of dogmatic approach. There's this sort of like paradigm of a singular path. And we really want to move people away from that thinking. And every condition, you have a bunch of different options in terms of what's the best treatment. And, surgery is often or sometimes it's the best plan, but it's not always the best plan. And so the expert medical opinion is essentially assessing those clinical cases to make sure that the patient is on the best, most optimal, cost-effective and clinically appropriate plan. So as a product lead on that team, I work with engineers, designers, data scientists, business development folks, strat ops, the C-suite to essentially create this offering, build it, and then deliver it to users so that we could provide value there. That's a long answer, but that's what I do currently. I absolutely love it. It's working on the intersection of software and medicine. So I work with doctors actually to build tools for doctors to use to help them take better care of patients. And the whole goal of everything that we do in healthcare technologies essentially comes down to three things. One, especially in the US, we want to reduce the per capita cost of healthcare. Mm-hmm. We want to improve healthcare outcomes. And then finally, we want to improve the experience of care for both providers and for patients. And so everything any healthcare tech companies actually comes down to one of those three things. It's actually called the triple aim of healthcare. So that's what I get. That's what I get to do every day. It's just absolutely amazing.
Nice. And I'm sure that comes with an insane amount of responsibility. That's not an easy problem to solve. And for anyone on the show, if you've ever had back pain before, that thing I don't think there's anything as debilitating sort of as back pain to just make you feel like almost useless, right? You have to stay still. So that's super important mission. And I think I oftentimes, you see folks in a lot of back pain and they get recommended surgery and you're like, oh my gosh, and things just get even worse and probably irreparable after that. Exactly. So I think it's a very important mission that you're on. So you said, you're a senior product manager. And I think for folks who are maybe looking for new careers, I think product managers are a relatively new field compared to, let's say, project management. And can you kind of highlight the differences there and the importance of a product manager? Yeah,
it's a really good question. And in fact, I would even introduce project manager, the acronym for that is PM. Product manager, the acronym is PM. And I would even introduce a third PM, and that's program managers. So within the tech space, you would often see product managers, project managers, and program managers. And it's super confusing oftentimes what the differences are. So just very simply, most people will be most familiar with project managers, and project managers are, as you would imagine, people who manage projects. And so a lot of the skills involved in that is ensuring that things happen on a particular schedule, ensuring that meetings occur in a way that drives everything forward in terms of the initiatives that you're working on. And that's project management. So the two things, product and program management, are actually sort of almost like a step above those things in terms of the responsibilities, in terms of how important that role is in the delivery of a particular product to the market. So I'll talk briefly about product managers first. So essentially, and this is in technology, so any technology product that you've ever used, oftentimes it's written in code. There's a code, so a programmer or a software engineer is the actual person writing the code. You're using YouTube, that's an app. You're using WhatsApp on your phone. If there's a new feature that shows up on Instagram, all of that stuff is code written by a software engineer. However, there's a lot of other things that have to happen in order for that feature, that product to be built and to get to market. For example, it needs to be designed. So there's a designer that's actually designing the interface, deciding what the buttons need to be from a visual design standpoint. There's interaction designers or user experience designers that work on how things flow. What is the actual experience of the user using the product? There are data scientists that help us decide what feature to build. There's business that we need to understand that a particular product or feature is driving the business forward. And so all of those different functions have to come together to successfully deliver a product or feature to market. And to bring all those things together, that is what a product manager does. So a product manager is essentially aggregating all the different experts and bringing that expertise to bear in order to make the product decisions that lead from some sort of idea for a new product or feature to delivering that product and feature to the market and having it do or solve the problems that you identified as you wanting to build that product or solution for. And so the product manager role is critical. It is the decision maker role. It is the role that drives clarity, that generates the energy for the team, and that is on the hook for delivering that final success to the user of that particular product. And I just said three things: drive clarity, generate energy, and deliver success. And those three tenets are actually the three core rules or core things that a PM at Microsoft has to deliver. So that's where I learned those three things. And essentially, it's super important in my career, because as long as everything I'm doing is driving towards those three things, then I'm successful as a product manager. So clarity is the most important thing. And it's even more important in healthcare technology, because there's so many problems in healthcare. There's so many things that we could potentially try to solve, and so many different ways of building those solutions. And as a product manager, it is my job to look at the landscape of all of that, look at the industry, look at the problems facing the various stakeholders in the healthcare space, patients, providers, and payers. And then we as product need to drive clarity in terms of decisions, in terms of what problems to go after and what solutions to build for those particular problems. So the PM role requires aggregating of other experts, which means that you kind of have to be a generalist in a lot of ways. I need to be able to have deep conversations with software engineers and data scientists and designers and business development folks, and be able to jump seamlessly between all of them. But then I also need to understand the core technology and understand the goals and what does success look like. And then I need to use that to drive the decisions. And the other key part of the PM role is that most of these other functions are not reporting to me. I am not their boss. And so one of the core and most important aspects of being a PM is what we call driving consensus or generating consensus, which is about getting the whole team to be marching to the beat of the same drum, going in the same direction. And it's one of those skills of a PM that is difficult to learn, difficult to teach, because it's really core people skills. And so the PM role requires a complete mix, a complete sort of like holistic development of both core hard skills around technology and business and data, as well as soft skills around how do you motivate people? How do you communicate in a way that people understand what the goals are? How do you get somebody to come over to your side of the fence if there's a disagreement? And in general, how do you make sure that people are motivated to build towards the version of reality that you have identified is a version of reality we have to build? So that's sort of like a description of what a product manager does. And within that team, there can be project managers that help to manage all these different projects that come together to deliver a product to market. So that's the difference between project and product managers. I'll just say one little thing about program management in a sense, and program management has a lot to do with coordinating various sort of product initiatives that may come together as a program. And so a program manager tends to have almost like a higher level purview or remit in terms of managing projects, managing how things work. So there's a lot of project management in program management, but they also have to have a lot more detailed knowledge around what is being built, because they also need to make decisions around prioritization, how to bring all these different initiatives together in order to drive towards business success.
Nice. That very, very comprehensive answer. And I think as folks go on and learn about your story, they'll understand why you're so sort of comprehensive. And you really work at the intersection of healthcare and AI, right? You originally went to school, have medical training. So you are the real doctor. I'm the fake one here. So give us a brief view of a definition of AI versus machine learning versus data science, right? Because you've worked at Google, you've worked at Microsoft, and we'll get more into that soon. And tell us, how do you sort of use those definitions in work as you interface with different data scientists and team members to, essentially change the future of health?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's at this stage, given that AI is such a buzzword, given that machine learning, it's you hear it every day. I mean, it's kind of hard to go even a 24-hour period without hearing some reference to AI. Um, and whether it's machine learning, deep learning, data science, I think from my perspective, I think the actual definitions at this point like matter less than the actual
Mm.
what these things are used for. So, in my mind, I think artificial intelligence is probably the biggest umbrella term. It's just basically, using technology, using computers, using code in order to be able to deliver some sort of smart or intelligent functionality, whatever you want to define smart or intelligent as. Um, and I think looking towards sort of machine learning and deep learning, these are, from my perspective, aspects or functions or specific topics within artificial intelligence that are based on using data to train a particular piece of software to then be smart or intelligent. And then finally, I think data science, is just essentially using data to make decisions, using data to better understand a problem, using data to make, product decisions, solution decisions, etc. And so from my perspective, the main reason or the most important aspect of those three terms is more so just describing a group of technologies that are being leveraged in order to solve problems. And so it's, to me, there's not, I mean, obviously it's a lot of hype because everybody talks about it, but at the end of the day, it's just a technology, it's just a tool that's used to solve problems. And particularly in healthcare, because healthcare is so data heavy, data rich, there's a ton of healthcare data being generated, then obviously the advances using artificial intelligence in healthcare is going to have to leverage large amounts of data, whether you want to call it big data, has to really do a better job or a good job of gathering, capturing, understanding, and then most importantly, being able to take action on that data. So it's really more about how can these tools be leveraged in order to generate actionable insights that then could be acted upon. So to me, the most important aspect of any of these technologies is what can it be used for in terms of solving a particular problem.
Yep. And I'm, very happy you brought that up. I think for anyone thinking of getting into data science, AI, machine learning, I'll say the three of them all the time just to be funny, is it really doesn't matter sort of what you go to school for to some degree, right? It's, what problems can you solve? And as Kwame is saying, if you have that skill set, you can solve problems with a different approach. You can solve probably much harder problems that can scale beyond what a single human can do. So just keep that in mind as you sort of navigate down your, let's call it your machine learning and AI career, and even your tech career, because I do feel that in the future, folks will just get a lot more interactions with data scientists and stuff like that as it becomes much more natural in different environments. So we'll get into some deeper parts of your journey, but can you give us a highlight of your journey from high school until now? I think you have a super interesting story.
Yeah, it's definitely sort of convoluted and kind of weird looking back at it, but sort of the highlight. So my inspiration to get into medicine in the first place started, unfortunately, with my grandmom having Alzheimer's. And so she died in my early teens. And that sort of like was the inspiration for me to even think about how the body works, how does the brain work, what is going on in a disease like Alzheimer's to lead to somebody not even recognizing their children or not, and all the things that we actually saw with that disease. And so that's what kind of led the inspiration to study, just to go towards medicine and neuroscience in particular. Ended up leaving Trinidad, getting a scholarship to go to Morehouse to study pre-med, and eventually went to Duke Med, which was my dream medical school. And sort of the whole like neuroscience, neurosurgery, I was planning to do neurosurgery. That plan kind of went according to plan up until I got to Duke. And it was when I got to Duke that a bunch of different things happened that caused me to rethink that plan. And essentially over the course of a few years of trying a bunch of different things, I realized that if I really wanted to contribute to medicine and contribute to pushing the boundaries of what was possible in medicine, that technology was going to be key in terms of a skill set for that. And I could talk about specifically what those signals were that sort of had me realize that. And with that realization, I now then determined that I needed to add or develop these tech skills if I really wanted to contribute to pushing the boundaries of what's possible in medicine. That led me to quit the job that I had at the time as a medical editor in healthcare advertising. I moved across the country from New York to Seattle, did a coding bootcamp, essentially became a software engineer, landed a software engineering internship at Microsoft. And I knew that combining that Duke MD with that Microsoft tech name, that would be that sort of combination of backgrounds that would allow me to, one, have the skill set in order to solve problems in medicine using technology, but also that combination would allow healthcare tech companies to recognize that skill set. And so said, so done. Once I was at Microsoft after 6 months, started to get, interview offers. Hey, come interview for these teams. And that's when I made that transition, because my first role at Microsoft wasn't in healthcare technology, but it was a core tech role that allowed me to learn about what being a product manager was at the company that essentially developed the whole product management function. So Microsoft was a company that recognized the need for a product manager to manage these development of these technology products. And once I had that combination of the skill set, then I was a matter of choosing where I wanted to go. I interviewed at a few healthcare tech startups, including Microsoft Health, Flatiron Health, Foundation Medicine in Boston, and eventually was recruited to join Google DeepMind Health. And that's where sort of my healthcare tech journey started back in 2018. And since then, I've had a couple different roles leading up to my current role where I'm leading this product team, building the second opinion product at Hinge Health. That's kind of like a high level career arc.
Yeah,
it's one of those. Yeah, it's one of those things that sounds really clear and kind of looking back, almost like Steve Jobs said, it's easy to connect the dots looking back. And so going through it was a lot different from looking back at it. And we could certainly get into different aspects of what that journey was actually like at different time points.
Yeah, I definitely think you're a crazy person, simply because like just watching, if you scan your LinkedIn, you're like, how do you go from Duke? Yep. Yeah. And you just legit just quit your job, fly across the country, do a coding bootcamp, and then land an internship at Microsoft, right? So I think that's a fantastic sort of shift. And something that you kind of brought up in a conversation that we had was this notion around you've become very good at shifting, right? Radically shifting what it is that you do. And I think for many folks that are maybe in the medical industry, their path is super defined. Once you specialize, probably like, okay, you can't just turn on 90 degrees and in 6 months completely change your career. Whereas with tech and machine learning and all that type of stuff, you have some of that option. Your medical expertise does have great value, right?
Yeah.
So can you talk to us about your time at Duke? Duke is one of, I don't know very much about the medical institutions, but I know like the name Duke, and that's pretty serious. So what was it like? How did you get a scholarship to go to your first college and then to Duke?
Yeah. So the whole academic aspect, I think, in a field like medicine, education and the amount of sort of professional knowledge you have to have is important. And I think it's very different from technology. And the main difference, and we could definitely, rabbit hole on this, but I think with medicine, you're required to sort of have a sort of a volume of knowledge, a fund of knowledge, and you have to do certain training in order to know how to apply that knowledge to take care of a patient. Whereas in tech, I think it's so results-based. It's much less importance on where you went to school. What is your credentials? It's more on what can you do? What problems can you solve? And so that's definitely one of the distinctions between those two fields. But even to end up being able to contribute to healthcare technology fields and projects and teams, my MD and my medical training is critically important. And in fact, my Duke MD has opened up so many doors on my journey to this point. And so it was very, very important, remains very important. And of course, Duke being a top medical school, it is a top medical school. And in fact, when I was there, it was ranked in the top five medical schools in the country.
Nice.
And so it was an excellent place to go to school, excellent place to learn about how to take care of patients and what is the actual implications of the healthcare industry and where it's going. And so just to talk about the journey, so I was born and raised in Trinidad, left Trinidad at the end of high school. I did A-levels and ended up getting a full scholarship, as I mentioned, to Morehouse College. And as most people know, that was just based on academic performance on the SATs, academic performance in high school in Trinidad, and also, as we all know, the importance of extracurriculars. And so I was heavily involved in different sports as well. I interestingly played 2 sports for Trinidad as a teenager, squash and cricket. And so just all of those things came together, and that's how I ended up landing that sort of full scholarship to Morehouse. And the Morehouse education was amazing. It is for people who don't know, it's a historically Black college in Atlanta, Georgia, and some of the biggest sort of alumni, Martin Luther King went to Morehouse, Samuel Jackson, Spike Lee. And so it's a really high quality education, particularly in pre-med. And so I knew going there would kind of set me up for success, and so said, so done, and ended up transitioning and getting into Duke Med School, which was my dream school, as I mentioned. And the transition from Morehouse to Duke was also very interesting and intense for a bunch of different reasons. I think the hardest part, or the most interesting aspect of that transition, was I was finally at a place that I've always been dreaming of. I'm finally at Duke Medical School, this storied institution of medical education. And in a lot of ways, I just wasn't happy. I wasn't, I'd finally made it, and I just wasn't happy. I looked around at my classmates, and obviously at Duke Med, there's lots of smart, talented people. I was smart and talented as well, but I just didn't feel like this was it. And one of the things that sort of happened was, because of that landing in a place or at a point that I've always been going towards, and then not feeling that comfort, not feeling that sense of accomplishment that I was hoping for, that actually led to a massive kind of essentially blowing up of my entire identity, my entire sort of understanding of what it even meant to be alive. And it was that sort of personal crisis in med school that led to my spiritual journey, led to me asking really deep questions about who are we? What am I here? Like, why did I always want to be a neurosurgeon? And then I'm here with this opportunity to be this neurosurgeon. And it's not feeling like this is what I'm supposed to be doing. There's just like a lot of resistance, a lot of tension, a lot of things happening that forced me to ask some very, very hard questions. And it was the hardest period of my life, that period in medical school, going through this transition. But I certainly would not have arrived at the place in my life now where I look around and the feeling of deep, deep gratitude I feel for what I'm able to do, I get paid to do every day, and seeing where I came from, it's like night and day. And the things that happened to lead to this position started all the way back in medical school. It started with really getting clear on what is important, asking really deep questions about myself, getting to know myself really, really well. And I think when we get into kind of like those tips or those principles or rules that I kind of live by, that sort of know thyself is key. And it caused me to ask very deep questions and understand, one, what led to me getting to that point. So it forced me to ask questions about, okay, why did I get to this point where I'm in a place where I wanted to be and not happy? What leads to that? Like, why would somebody accomplish something amazing, which was getting into Duke Med? The odds of getting into Duke Med as an international student was insane.
Yeah.
It was
you were an international student too?
Yeah, I was an international student getting into med school, and it was literally any student. I think it was a 1 in 100 chance of getting in. So when you apply to get an interview and then to get in, and then on top of that, international students getting into medical school in the States, it's like minuscule. So, all of that worked really hard and then end up in somewhere that I'm not happy. And so the concept of shifting that you mentioned started then. It was like, clearly this thing that I thought I wanted, I didn't. There was some disconnect there. And so like the quest to essentially never be in that situation again, that's where it started. And part of that quest is to develop a level of understanding of yourself and an understanding of truth and reality that is so clear that I personally would never end up in a situation where I land on something, accomplish something, and then I'm like, oh shit, this is not really what I wanted. And so getting super clear on that is something that I've been working on constantly. And it's an iterative process. It's always sort of a work in progress in a way. And I think that's some of the lessons that I learned, and really being clear on, do you actually want this, and why do you want it, and getting down into the deep nitty gritty of exactly what are the motivations, and really understanding what it is you want, and getting very clear on why you want it. And then it's only with that clarity that you could get onto a path now that when you land up somewhere, you could sort of feel very aligned and clear, where everything sort of feels like it's supposed to be happening. And so I think that's definitely one of those tenets, is like the effort it takes to ask yourself really hard questions. That's one thing I've been able to do very well. And that has led me to be able to make massive shifts in a way that leads me to be much more aligned and happy and comfortable and content with who I'm being in my life.
So I wanted to ask a question around, so you have the life crisis, and I think I would say I experienced something similar through my studies, and it may be a function of doing something where you have to commit for such a long time, and you're like, what the hell am I doing? Like, do I really? So
exactly.
It's very interesting that, and I do feel that medical people probably feel it the most, because it's something you have to commit your whole life to almost, right? Which is really scary to some degree. And you were a technical writer after you left. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight, especially for the younger crowd that may listen to the show, that in high school, even in college, I think writing is such a hidden skill, but it's probably one of the most valuable skills to communicate in text. And I had asked you that a while back. Can you share some insights on the value of writing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So yeah, it's the way that sort of transition happened was essentially after medical school, I had ended up going to grad school. So I was doing a PhD at Duke as well in neurobiology. And I essentially was a poor grad student, and I was looking for ways to earn more money. And there was a flyer that I saw on campus where a company was looking for people with MDs or PhDs or people in medical school, essentially anybody who can write well, but also understands biomedical science and all the jargon that involves in medicine, because the company works with doctors and scientists who are trying to publish papers in academic journals. And so we help doctors and scientists polish up those manuscripts, make sure that what they're communicating is actually getting the point across in the for maximal impact, maximal clarity. And so I ended up applying for this role. This was a part-time role. And the reason why I applied, like, I'd always been good at writing. Friends would send me their essays for business school or med school and say, hey, Kwame, how could I make this song better? They would send me cover letters, resumes, etc. So I've always sort of known the importance of communicating. And when you ask a question about writing, I would expand that into communicating, because I think writing is just one form of communicating. And I think it is absolutely one of the hidden tools or hidden skills that I think is often overlooked in terms of how important it is. The reason why I say that is essentially everything that happens in life happens at the point of an interaction with a human being. So even when we talk about systemic this, or, the system is corrupt, it's all based on people. Everything happens at that personal interaction. Somebody's interacting with you in some way. And so when you think of what those interaction points are, it's on various ways of communicating. And so speech, text, writing, fashion, how you look, how you carry yourself, body language, all of that is communication. And so as you move through your life, in order to maximize the positivity of any interaction you have that may move your life in any direction, maximizing and optimizing what you are communicating to every single person that you may interact with or may interact with you is important. And one of the things that not only that role, being a medical editor, taught me around communication and communicating clearly, in addition to that, I was also a little bit of a communication nerd, in that when I was even in grad school and in med school, when I used to write up my medical notes in medical school as a med student, they were beautiful. I wanted them to tell a clear story. And one of the things that I also did, I took the initiative to take a course in grad school called Writing from the Reader's Perspective. And it was one of the most paradigm shifting courses I have ever done in my life. And I've done a lot of school. And essentially it was taught by a guy who had a JD, a law degree and a PhD degree. And his whole purpose, he was a professor of rhetoric. at Duke. And his whole purpose was to teach grad students, postdocs, doctors, lawyers, all the sort of academic personnel at Duke, how to write better. And as I mentioned, the course was called Writing from the Reader's Perspective.
Yes.
So this course involved breaking down communication and understanding how different types of communication lead to different outcomes. I remember there was one course where he was talking about how insurance companies, car companies communicate around recalls. So recall of a car, if the car has a malfunction, there's a way that you could talk about that to make people really scared. And there's a way you could talk about that to have people like get that letter and throw it in the back of their kitchen. So the course had you break down when you communicate, what's important about that communication. When you write a sentence, where you put things in the sentence makes a difference in terms of how people interact with that communication. And so through that course, as well as working with a doctor or scientist to write a manuscript about their research in order so that anybody reading that manuscript, reading that abstract could understand what's the value of it, what is the impact, and also could understand clearly and is not confused by what is going on. So all of those things led to me developing a very clear understanding of the importance of communicating clearly, communicating for impact. And you can't do any of those things without actually knowing the thing you're communicating about. And so when you interview for positions, when you go talk to somebody about their career, when you're trying to make any moves about anything, you are communicating about yourself. Yeah. And so with that, because I was able to communicate well about myself, that was driven by a deep knowledge of self. So that know thyself keeps coming up. And all of that kind of led me to get very good at communicating, not just about myself, but communicating about problems, communicating about products. And so as a product manager, one of the biggest roles that I play is on communicating, because like I said, as a PM, we work with so many different functions. The conversation I would have about a product with an engineer is very different from the conversation I'll have about that product with a sales or marketing person. That's very different from having that conversation with a business development person. And again, the skill of being able to calibrate or articulate and adapt the communication to those different functions also not only drives success or ability or performance as a PM, but I feel that I could talk about anything to anyone in a way that understands what are they expecting, what is their perspective, what are their problems, what are they thinking. And when you have that type of understanding of every communication, you're constantly looking, what is the audience thinking? What is the reader's perspective? What is the interviewer's perspective? Everything I do, when I help somebody write a resume, what is the hiring manager's perspective? And so it's constantly living life with that ability to look at things from the other perspective. And I think that is a implication or sort of consequence of understanding communication that drives so much other benefits. Because if you could communicate well with everybody, that means that one, you understand how to know things, whether it's communicating about yourself, communicating about a topic, and you know how to look at things from different perspectives. And that skill, that is the skill. That is problem solving, that is communicating, that is any type of performance. It's all about how do you look at a problem and look at it from different angles, be able to slice it up. And then how do you look at yourself from different perspectives and really being able to shift from those things quickly and efficiently in order to be able to make very big decisions and make big moves. So I think, that's a pretty long answer to talk about the importance of communication and why writing and why all those things are really important. It causes you to know things well, because if you have to communicate about something, if you have to teach about a topic, you better know what you're talking about. So it forces that, as well as when you're giving a speech or you're talking or you're teaching a class or you're teaching about something. In order to do that well, you have to be constantly sort of understanding what is this audience thinking. You're teaching a class, what questions are coming up in their mind, so that as you speak and as you communicate, you could address those questions. And so I think the value of communication is way further. It has a ripple effect way, way, way further than a lot of people tend to grasp or to understand.
Yeah, I'm happy you really pushed into that point, simply because I think we are trained by whatever system it is that we live in to think, I have this credential, I can do these things, right? Whereas I think a lot of the progress that you've made has come from a lot of communication, and now you're a senior product manager for like a high growth startup in Silicon Valley. And that means like your communication skills need to be, on 10x essentially. And it's not something you really maybe focus on in school. So before we kind of hop into like, you hopped into this coding bootcamp, I actually wanted to share a quick story on this writing thing. And it became super important. I watched this talk from, I don't know if it's the same professor that taught your class, which would have been cool. And he really spoke about, in school, we are trained to write for a teacher to review, right? That's how you're trained. And that teacher gets paid to review your work. In reality, no one gets paid to read your shit. So, but you are writing it as if they are being paid to read it. And that was such a big just flip switch in my mind as to, no one cares about what I read, what I write. So, what do they care about? Coming back to sort of that person's perspective. And I think after thinking about that through the textual format, that got me to really start reinforcing the thing that you're sharing is that, hey, how does this person want to be communicated with? Right. And what's really important for them, not just shut yourself down and try to get that person sort of satisfied. So happy that you spent some time there. And I think the one thing I want everyone to remember in a lot of these shows and interviews that we do, some things are very simple, right? And it's not things that you learn in school. It's actually a lot of you are bringing, especially being in Caribbean, probably talking a lot of shit, just all of that to a lot of different people. It's a good skill if you could talk shit really good, right? At least I've definitely abused that skill to connect with a bunch of different people. So tell us about, you're this medical writer, sort of a broke PhD student, and you're like, coding bootcamp, and you fly definitely on the opposite end of the country in America and go do this thing. Big leap of faith.
Yeah, it was interesting, and in fact, it was such a big leap. I literally sort of look at my life before and after the bootcamp, and the bootcamp represented so many aspects of change and aspects of making big shifts that it sort of really opened me up to being able to do that at will. So moving into a new career is always difficult. A career change is always difficult, particularly trying to move into tech with zero tech background. Like I literally remember the first day I learned what a P tag was in HTML. And so for people who don't know, HTML is sort of the backbone of websites essentially. And so to build every website, you need to understand HTML. So it's such a foundational building block. And I didn't even know the basics of that. And to go from knowing that to then understanding technology and understanding how things work. And when you see a website or you log into Gmail and you type your password, what is actually happening on the back end? For me, it was like seeing behind the curtain of so many things where like things are, you could now understand why things are built in certain ways and how things work. And the thing that sort of led to that shift was that I was able to first focus really, really strongly on what I wanted and what I wanted to do or have, what the impact I wanted to have. And that was on pushing the boundary of what's possible in medicine. I realized that somehow as a calling, I wanted to be able to say, based on my work, based on something that I did, a doctor is now able to do something that they couldn't do before. And so with that sort of motivation, that is one of the reasons I was able to kind of essentially burn everything in my life down to the ground, move across the country from New York to Seattle and enter into this sort of 4-month boot camp, which was the hardest thing I've ever done intellectually, harder than medical school. Wow. And it's weird when people hear that because it's like, well, medical school is often considered as hardest intellectual pursuit. And while it is intellectually very challenging, it's less focused on problem solving. And I think technology it's all problem solving. And I think because of that, it was really intellectually challenging because I had to kind of shift my thinking a lot. But it was also really enjoyable because I knew myself and I knew that being intellectually challenged is always something that sort of like excites me and gets me into flow states. So while it was scary, while it was a big decision, the couple things that made it easy was one, being really clear that to get to where, like, I knew where I wanted to get to. I wanted to be able to, whether it's working at companies like Google or wherever, I wanted to be an expert in healthcare technology, because healthcare technology was and is the thing that will advance medicine and will allow doctors to have more options when they're taking care of patients. So with that clarity, the only way I could get there is with understanding technology. And so the motivation wasn't even on the bootcamp itself. It wasn't even on any credential I was going after. It was actually on simply getting to a point where I understand these things well enough, where I could look at a problem that a doctor has and be like, I could come up with a solution and I could build that solution so that that problem is taken care of. So it's actually very simple in that mindset, in that way, where the clarity I had drove a lot of those decisions, and the clarity made it really easy when I was, trying to figure out why my program had a bug in it at 3 a.m. and, can't sleep. And I'm constantly thinking about this problem, because I knew understanding this and developing this skill set would allow me to then be able to sit in the conference rooms that I sit in now, sit in the meetings that I sit in now, and be able to make the type of decisions that I am being trusted to make. And I think it was just being very clear on understanding the skills that are required in order for me to have the impact that I wanted to have. And that focus on skill development is something that I learned in medical school, and something that I take even to this day, where it's you want to focus on passions, you want to focus on what you're interested in, you want to focus on all these things. But at the end of the day, in order to have impact, you need to have a certain type of skill, whether it's an understanding of a domain, whether it's the understanding of how to solve a particular type of problem. All of it requires you to have something. And by focusing on those skills and developing those things, eventually you then get to a point where you have a group of these skills that when you combine them, now you can look at a problem, understand the problem in ways that most people, when they look at the problem, can't understand it. And then you could bring all of that understanding to bear when you come up with solutions to those problems. And at the end of the day, technology and technology companies are simply solving problems. And that is the skill. Problem solving. And I think all of that led to being in a position where the problem solving muscle is well developed and can be deployed at will to pretty much any problem.
So given that you finish this bootcamp, you get this internship, you hustle, I imagine, to a big degree, and you get this internship at Microsoft, you get a full offer from Microsoft, you have a pretty decent tenure there, and then all of a sudden, Google decides, Google/DeepMind. And for folks that don't know about DeepMind in the world of AI and machine learning, they are, almost the top company, right? I think they spend like $687 million a year on just doing research. That's just their money to just have fun, I guess. And, you got recruited by them to build out healthcare products. Tell us about that journey.
Yeah, that was an interesting journey. I think as I tell this story, one of the core things that have been consistent in this career arc that I've done, once I had decided and gotten very clear on the actual impact I wanted to have in my life, that clarity of that decision led to a ton of other things happening that I could only describe as being kind of like magical. And it's one of those things where, like, it's, as I think through the things that happened once I made that decision, the getting into that coding bootcamp, one thing that I had to do was to afford it. Coding bootcamps are not cheap. They are, range between $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 for like 3-4 months of education. And it's a bootcamp, so you can't be working at the same time either. And so, I got a full scholarship to that bootcamp. I have no idea how I did that. The internship that I ended up getting at Microsoft that you mentioned, they required a full year of professional software engineer experience. Whoa. You had to be working as a software engineer for a year. I had been 2 months after my bootcamp, and I got into that internship. And so a lot of things happened. And then once in that internship, like I said, my plan was to be a software engineer for a couple of years in healthcare technology and then transition into product. I was offered a PM role right after that internship. And I was like, of course I will do it. And like you mentioned, once I had that Microsoft pedigree or Microsoft experience on top of my Duke MD, I was recruited by DeepMind to come and build software products. And that whole process, again, was also very serendipitous. I ended up meeting a DeepMind employee at a conference that I went to, and it was just a very light conversation. I passed on my contact information. DeepMind at the time was building healthcare products using the AI, but they were based in London, and I was like, had no interest in moving across the planet. And it was just a matter of like, it was really nice to meet you, goodbye, and I went on my way. A few months later, they were expanding into the US, and that is how I ended up getting recruited to join DeepMind. And again, it was simply because at that time, what they needed was someone who had medical expertise, who understood the medical field and also understood technology. And I had both. And so again, I had skills in both of those domains, so that when I joined the team and we were building our healthcare technology solutions, I have a leg up in terms of most of the other product people, because once I talk to doctors about, hey, how do you find medical information? I exactly, I understand what they're doing. I understand their pain points in a way that most people without that background don't have. And also because I had done other things in healthcare as well, like I didn't just stick with medical education. I did biomedical research. I did academic publishing. I did medical editing. That allowed me to have such a breadth of understanding as well, that it brings a lot of depth in terms of the way I approach problems, the way I understand problems, the way I describe problems. And then also, as you could imagine, that leads to better solutions. It leads to better considered solutions. You consider much more edge cases. You bring a more thorough understanding of the solution space as well. And so both of those kind of combined to allow me to then quickly develop expertise in a field, because I'd never worked in healthcare technology before DeepMind, to very quickly learn and ramp up in a way that could then drive clarity, generate that energy and deliver success, which is that core sort of three-pronged kind of success metric in a sense of being a solid PM. And so that transition was really, really interesting. Being at a company like Google DeepMind, particularly when they had decided essentially to really dive into healthcare. And so I was at Google at a point when they decided to go into healthcare with the formation of Google Health as a sort of product area, and looking at the ways that Google was looking at the problems they wanted to solve and how to actually solve those problems, then not only gave me a good foundation in terms of understanding the space and understanding the ways to build and leverage the best of technology to solve those problems, but as you could imagine, having that Google DeepMind name on my resume as well gives me a certain level of credibility, a certain level, having that experience, then, I could bring that sort of best in class understanding to basically solve problems wherever I may go at whatever type of company that I may be at.
So I want to ask, you went from, you went to Duke. So I imagine, let's talk about imposter syndrome, right? So going from your college to Duke, that's like, oh crap, these people are on a different level. And then from, Duke into the boot camp, that was probably another just maybe slap in your face. And I imagine meeting real hardcore software engineers at Microsoft who've been there for 10, 15 years.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then you hop over to Google.
Yeah, it's been constant. And I think, getting comfortable with that type of discomfort is something that has been very core to me, not only being successful, but being happy. Because I think, success and achievement and whatever you want to call it has to happen with discomfort, has to happen with growth, and being comfortable with that discomfort, or at least finding a way to enjoy some aspects of that, is really, really important, because it's bread and butter. It's bread and butter to growing. It's bread and butter to constantly getting to that next level. So if you are shunning or trying to hide or run away from discomfort, that makes that process much, much, much more difficult in order to navigate and be able to, almost seek out certain levels of discomfort and seek out those opportunities for growth. And you tend to see people who I think move very quickly or advance very quickly. The thing that they are very good at is going after those opportunities that would allow them to grow as quickly as possible, while also developing the skills along the way. And so there's a lot of that fake it till you make it aspect of it. And I think because of that, imposter syndrome has, it's the perfect environment for imposter syndrome to sort of sprout up, because it's like oftentimes you're doing things that you've never done before, or you're doing things that, maybe you've done once. Interestingly, though, medical education actually prepared me very well for that situation.
Oh.
And the reason is, in medical school or in medical training, there is this sort of concept on what is it called? It's called see one, do one, teach one. And so that concept, as you could imagine, if you're learning how to put in a central line into somebody's neck, for example, the paradigm is you see one, you see somebody do it, you do one, and then you teach. So the whole way of learning is you learn as quickly as possible. You watch somebody do it. You learn by just watching, because that's a basic part of education. Then you learn by doing, which is critical to anything. You can't really know something if you don't know how to do it. And then finally, to prove that you know how to do it, you teach it. You cannot teach somebody something if you don't understand it.
Yeah.
And so that whole paradigm of very quickly learning something quickly, and then not only learning it, but being able to apply it, being able to teach somebody, that is a core paradigm of medical training. And a lot of technology, in a lot of ways, you build things, you've never built something before. And you need to be able to have that skill where even if you don't understand something very well, you're not an expert, you could still get in there and deliver value and know something in order to be able to teach it or to be able to deliver some sort of success or solution. So all of that, I think, is a nice hotbed in a lot of ways for imposter syndrome to develop, because you're constantly questioning, am I good enough for this? Do I know how to do this? And for me personally, because of all those environments that you mentioned, where I'm always sort of like jumping into a fire in a sense, where it's like, oh shit, I'm here now, I need to pick up things quickly. It's being constantly in that situation or those types of situations that, one, led to a lot of very rapid growth, but also absolutely led to a lot of imposter syndrome. And it's something that I deal with constantly. Like I was mentioning to you earlier, like the new role that I'm in, I've been at Hinge Health for about 3 months now, and joining a team that, as you could imagine, is just on this exponential kind of hockey stick, rocket ship type growth, as well as a team that is bringing together the best talent. It was really, really difficult kind of landing here at Hinge and seeing and working in a team that's actually like really, really pushing the boundaries of what can be accomplished per unit time. That, again, the sort of imposter syndrome, am I good enough? Was this a fluke? All of these types of thoughts, even to this day, given the things I've accomplished, still comes up. And I think one of the things that probably would be valuable, I think, for anybody on any journey is really to understand that these things typically don't go away. It's always there. You always may have that second guessing. And I think the thing that has changed for me is that I interact with that imposter syndrome differently. I know it's there, I feel it, but I'm able to sort of sit with that discomfort in a way that allows me to essentially weather those storms that we'll always hit, where we second guess our abilities to contribute. And I think at the end of the day, once we understand ourselves well around what type of validation we may need or be seeking, and we are able to not be caught up in that, but to at least, even if you're still experiencing it or going through it, at least you could be observing it to a point where you're less caught up in the emotions of that type of feeling. But imposter syndrome is definitely something that I deal with really well, and really often. And I almost feel like I could write a book on it, because it's always there. It's always sort of like just right behind you, just always ready to pounce in a way if you allow sort of negativity, if you allow certain things to kind of creep up from an emotional standpoint. So yeah, it's like, I think it's something that we all deal with in tech, and it's because of the nature of constantly growing. If you really want to grow fast, you're going to have to put yourself in situations that you may not have been in before. And that obviously would lead to very real and very valid questioning of, can I do this? Do I have the skills? Do I have the ability? And it's not really about trying to get rid of imposter syndrome. It's more about how do you navigate it? How do you recognize when it comes up? And then what do you do to move past it, move around it in whichever way that is effective for you to then have the impact you want to have.
Yeah, and coming back to your skills as well. So something you just said around putting lines in people's necks, and I was like, I see somebody put a line on, and I'm assuming maybe that's like a vein or some blood vessel into someone's neck. And then, I'm going to try it. And then, I'm going to teach someone to do it. But I almost think that you being in the medical field, versus like writing a piece of software, I watch this guy code this thing, I'm going to try to code it. I'll teach somebody to code it. Oh, what if I get it wrong? Okay, my program crashed. But if you get someone's vein in their neck wrong, they're dead. So that's like a whole different level of, having to get this thing right. So your threshold for imposter syndrome must have been way higher than someone writing some code, right?
Yeah, exactly. It is a different sort of, the stakes tend to be much higher. Obviously, you make a mistake in medicine, people can die. And of course, some software medicines, especially these days where software is controlling so much of our lives, it can certainly lead to significant issues at the same time. But yeah, there's a different level of hey, if I mess this up, what are the consequences for the most part? And I think, taking care of health, taking care of patients in healthcare also probably helps with mitigating or navigating those things, because yes, you're right, I've had to kind of navigate imposter syndrome in an environment where the stakes are very high. It's like literally people's lives are in your hands. So that maybe makes it easier for me to navigate it when the stakes are not as high, but it certainly doesn't feel that way.
Right. Yeah. And it's all relative. I definitely don't want to be under that pressure to put something in someone's neck.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask a question, right? We've kind of gone into your story about how you got here as a medical professional to now a technology professional, more specifically a senior product manager. And I imagine there are other folks such as yourself in the medical field, even young folks who may be thinking about, hey, I want to be in the medical field. And I think throughout history, it's just been this straight road and just get ready for the long, 10 times the marathon, essentially. What would you say to them now, given that technology is in its state and machine learning and AI and all that stuff is now here?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, like it doesn't really require any new kind of thinking or paradigms. But it does probably require application of well-known paradigms or concepts in new ways. And so what I mean by that is traditional part, like for example, to medicine. While it may seem as it's very sort of clear-cut and the way medical education is, it's very sort of sequential, there's certain things you have to do. At the end of the day, all of those things are geared towards solving a problem. If you're on a track to be a neurosurgeon, what problem are you solving? You're learning to take out tumors in the brain, for example. And that's the problem that you're solving. And so when you look towards making decisions from a career standpoint, it's all about problems. And the differences in career paths just comes down to the different types of problems you might want to go after. If you prefer, to figure out the problems of what needs to happen for a building to go up and be solid and not fall down, that's civil engineering. If you decide you want to go after problems related to mental health, then you might go into therapy. So at the end of the day, it's all about looking at the problems you want to solve. And so when I talk to people who are either in healthcare, thinking about healthcare, always wanted to be a doctor, always wanted to be a nurse, what I tend to do in those conversations is step back a little bit and just focus on the problems they want to solve. And oftentimes people don't think about that. They think, oh, I want to be a doctor. And I had that same problem. I didn't think about the problems I actually wanted to solve. And the problems I want to solve, like I mentioned, pushing the boundary of what's possible in medicine. I didn't have to go to medical school to do that. However, the skill that I developed helped that. But at the end of the day, right now, what I tend to tell people to do is to step back and focus on the type of problems you want to be solving. And when you get clear on that, then it makes career decisions really easy. So even within healthcare, there are tons of problems, and only some of those problems are solved by doctors. And so when people start to understand all the different problems that are facing medicine or facing healthcare or wellness or however you want to slice it, medicine or going down that path of becoming a doctor or nurse or healthcare professional is one of those multitude of ways to solve the multitude of problems. So again, in my current role, I work very closely with orthopedic surgeons. I work very closely with nurses, but I also work very closely with technology people and designers. And again, it's because I have chosen the type of problems that I want to solve. I don't want to solve the problem of a patient having a tumor necessarily. That's what the orthopedic surgeon is doing. What I want to solve is the problem of the orthopedic surgeon having tools at their disposal in order for them to be the best doctor and deliver the best possible care to patients. Now, when I talk to people about the problems they want to solve, if they want that, I just want to help, patients. And most people, when they want to go into medicine, that's what it is. If they want to help suffering at some level, there are so many ways of being able to help that particular problem. And I think most people, because as you mentioned, most medical training and medical paradigms are very clear cut. Most people don't step back from that and sort of step out the box in a sense. And I think it is that process of really stepping back and then expanding your view is really what I was forced to do when I realized that neurosurgery wasn't for me. Like, I was in that track. And like I said, the situation did that for me. It broke everything down. At the first time in my life, I was like, oh shit, I am not going to be a neurosurgeon. What does that really be? So instead of me focusing on being a neurosurgeon, I started to focus on what problems do I want to solve, what type of impact I want to have. And it was because of that, I was able to step back and be like, I actually don't want to be a neurosurgeon. What I want to do is help expand what is possible in medicine. And so once I was able to do that, then obviously the tricky part now is figuring out how to actually do that. There's so many ways to do that.
Right.
And it just came down to trying a bunch of different things. Like I did, as we mentioned, I tried all different things in between medical school and landing up at Microsoft. There's a bunch of different things in between there. And it was only with that exploration that I was able to kind of navigate that, understand myself, know myself better in order to really make those decisions. And it was only with that knowledge that I was actually to make bold decisions and completely shift multiple times and jump into situations that most people are like, why? I was not even at Google for 2 years before I left, and really being able to make those jumps because I'm very, very clear about what it is I'm trying to do, what impact I want to have. And so in that way, I'm able to make very smart and very confident moves where I land up in situations where it's like, okay, this is specific for me to grow in this particular way. These are the skills I'm here to develop, instead of being sort of blinded by the title, oh, I'm at Google, or oh, I'm a neurosurgeon, or oh, I'm a doctor. It's much more about what are you doing that for? What is the why underneath all of those things? And it's only by really understanding that we could make decisions and choices that are much better aligned with who we are and who we want to be.
So yeah, I've been thinking about what problems I'm trying to solve.
So, it's all about the problems. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's something I definitely share with a lot of, I want to call them younger data scientists, but folks entering the field. And they always ask the question, school, blah, 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 PhD, blah, blah. I'm just like, I don't care. Like, can you solve this problem or not? Otherwise, you shouldn't be on the team.
Exactly.
Type thing, right? So this show is called the Caribbean Data Science Podcast. And, the intention is to highlight the stories of people from the Caribbean doing great things, AI, machine learning, and tech. And can you tell us how being from the Caribbean has benefited you in navigating your career? As a senior product manager, you have to be an ultra communicator. And then we kind of highlighted maybe, talking shit with everybody at home gives you this ability to flex with different people. But can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one. And I think it's just to double click on that point as well. I think growing up and being from the Caribbean gives you an understanding of other perspectives. It's like, for example, I think remembering like growing up watching news, there was always like, yes, there's local news, but there was always this international kind of like understanding as well. So I think being from a small place, knowing that what we have is probably limited or different compared to, or smaller in some ways compared to what else may be out there. I think that sort of constantly, and for me personally, has given me that awareness that my understanding of how I think something should be is just my understanding of it. And there are other ways of doing that. There are other ways. People like in Trinidad, compared to the US, people drive on the other side of the road. There's other things or other ways of doing things that I think, for me, growing up in the Caribbean and sort of always having that understanding, that sort of looking outward type of thing is critically important. But also it comes with equally looking inward and actually appreciating the beauty of our small islands, the beauty of our culture. And so I think it gives a nice balance of appreciating what you have, loving our beautiful weather, beaches, our great food, but also understanding that as great as those things may be, there are other ways of doing things. There are other aspects of culture. There are other ways of approaching work or career that also may be valuable or have impact. So I think that's one thing that's being from the Caribbean, at least for me, has really helped me. It's everything I'm looking at is like, this is my perspective, but I'm constantly, okay, what else is out there? What other ways of looking at this problem exist? I think the communication aspect you just mentioned, or just being able to, be able to flow and have relationships with people from all types of backgrounds, cultures, especially from Trinidad in particular, but just from the Caribbean, given that we have so many different cultures, dialects, languages, histories, and all in sort of a melting pot, especially when you look at the Caribbean, and having that understanding and that ability to really interact with people from all types of walks of life, all different types of perspectives also really helps from a product perspective in terms of me interacting with people from different cultures, but also just, again, understanding and being able to adapt to multiple situations. And again, that adaptability, that flexibility, plasticity in a way is really critically important. And I think the third thing I would say, I have two more things. I think the quality of our education. I think the way that we focus on education, at least in my household and in my family, like not doing well or not valuing education wasn't even a choice. And so I think that value of education is probably core to why you see so many Caribbean people and Trinidadians in particular excelling everywhere. Because again, it's all about learning and education. And I think we value that well, despite the sort of probably problems that our educational system has, which are very real. I think the sort of cultural understanding of the importance of education is really driving a lot of that success in a way, because when we land up in a place with a lot of opportunities, we are able to grab onto those opportunities and make the most of it. And the final thing I would say in terms of sort of being Caribbean and almost like Trinidad in particular, again, is the, I've always gone back to the concept of bad mind. That sort of concept where like, the very Trini thing where like, no matter where you are, what trenches you're in, what problems you're in, you're like, nah, I decide, I get and I go in, I get into it. And I think that concept for me, particularly with the struggles and the setbacks and all the crazy three-way transitions I've had, I have had to use bad mind a lot, where it's like, I have no idea how I'm going to figure this out. You're getting pressure from all sides, second guessing yourself, imposter syndrome, trying to prove your value, trying to solve complicated problems. All of that requires a level of bad mind to be able to just push through it and come out the other side. And so I think all of those things, part of that sort of being from the Caribbean, whether we small, but punching way above our weight class in terms of achievement, in terms of how we impact the world, whether you look at people like Brian Lara, Atto Bolden from a sporting standpoint, whether you want to look at all the people who are trainees who are studying in the US right now, or the trainees who are in data science and technology and AI careers, like the success speaks for itself. And so there are absolutely various aspects of just growing up in the Caribbean that equips us with a whole bunch of different skill sets, personality types, abilities that absolutely help us achieve lots of success and be able to drive a lot of value, no matter where we end up. Because I think we have that sort of core aspect of learning, of sort of bad mind and getting through anything, that sort of understanding of there's always a solution. And I think there's one other thing that just came to me too, and I'm blanking on what we call it, but basically, that concept where you always figure out a way to get through, like where there's a loophole or, cutting corners. Trainees in particular always have some way to get something done.
To get done.
You have to get it done. And so I think that is also a key aspect. I've had people tell me that I am relentless when it comes to problems, and particularly the problems that I go after. Like, one of my core things in life is like, I don't want to solve small problems. I've never wanted to do that. It's why I wanted to do neurosurgery. Neurosurgery is one of the hardest things. And within neurosurgery, I wanted to do skull-based neurosurgery. And so skull-based neurosurgery is a neurosurgery at the base of the skull, where you have to go in there and you slip a millimeter, the patient going to bleed out. You slip another millimeter, the patient will be blind. And so I've always gone after complicated problems. And so I think, having that sort of gumption or the guts or the aspect of just, you're always going to find a way through. I have had people tell me in my role, in my career, that I am relentless when it comes to solving problems. And as soon as I go after one solution and that don't work, it's like, oh, okay, let me try this and let me try this. And almost having an unlimited supply of extra things to try. It allows me to have a way, and the problems that I go after, building solutions for doctors in the healthcare space, it is very complicated. And there's always some kind of roadblock because of regulatory things, because it's healthcare, because of the mess of healthcare data. There's always something you can't do. And so because of that, I think that other aspect of being from the Caribbean, being from a smaller society in a sense where it's like you have to kind of push to get things done sometimes. And you just have to figure out ways to get through things. And I think that core aspect, in addition to bad mind and all those other things, has been really important, bringing that kind of Caribbean vibe and that Caribbean aspect to everything that I do. And I think it's something that I think a lot of us do probably unconsciously. And we'll probably be able to have more leverage that if we are able to kind of own it and talk about why these islands, these sort of 40 million people, why are we able to do the things that we've been able to do over history with the creativity, the reggae, the soca, the steel band, the carnival, the creativity, the problem solving, all of it for such a small group of people. And it's a special place. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that value, because oftentimes, and this is another thing I would say, oftentimes I think it takes people from the Caribbean, it takes kind of stepping out of the Caribbean, living in somewhere else to recognize the value of it, exactly, to really value it. And I think oftentimes there's a taking for granted that happens for people who live in the Caribbean and don't actually leave to really see how amazing it is, how amazing the Caribbean islands are, despite obviously lots of very real and valid problems. But I think oftentimes we almost tend to be hypercritical of ourselves as a people and as a region that we should not be as much. And I think we can find a better way to balance holding ourselves to high standards while also acknowledging our amazing sort of cultural and ingrained positive strengths that we can bring to anywhere that we go on the planet, or to solve any potential problems, because Trinis in particular, we will always find a way.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because I'd never necessarily thought about the bad mind thing. I was like, shit, yeah, that kind of make, like, it's somewhere inside there. I think some people are a little more outward, like, for instance, Jamaicans, like, it's very outward, like, nah, you ain't doing nothing, you matter.
Yep, exactly.
And I think maybe Trinidadians are a little more reserved, but they still have that, nah, you're not gonna do that to me. No, I'm not gonna fail. Yep. And what's interesting, as I think back at all the interviews that I've done so far, I think each person has had their own little kind of bad mind, some a little more outward, some inside. Yep. So, it's really nice that you brought that out. And ultimately the resolve, I think, is maybe something embedded in our cultures, where maybe a lot of our ancestors were brought to the Caribbean, not necessarily by choice sometimes. And you've had to just, do things you didn't like to do for a long time. Yep. And that's a great skill. I guess another one of the skills to add to the bucket, right? I imagine.
Absolutely.
Studying for, to become a neurosurgeon must have been very painful at different times. Great. So a couple more questions as we get closer to the end. So you've achieved a great deal in your career so far. And I think one of the other things I wanted to highlight in the show is that most people that we bring on, they're continuously pushing, right? You've been at Microsoft, Google, and I think most people would have been like, oh, Google is up, and I'm good, but you're like, I'm just getting started. So what continues to push you? And maybe tell us quickly a bit about some of your role models, and how do you keep pushing to the next level?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is something that I actually consciously think about, a lot. It's like, the relatively consistent or constant desire to continue to grow and continue to get to that next level and expand. And, I think it's really hard to talk about where that comes from, because for me personally, it's always been there. I remember when I was 6-7 years old, reading, West Indian Reader and reading all these different books. I used to read books from back to front and have a sense of pride in knowing everything in these books and being able to master something. So I think, to me, it comes down to what feels like a very innate or inherent motivation to be the best version of myself and to constantly push. And I don't know exactly where that comes from, so I can't give a concrete answer to that. Like, I didn't develop it, because I'm at age 5, 6, 7. where did I develop that? And I think so it really comes down to just an innate desire for mastery. And I think I've always had that. Anything I was doing, I want to be good at it. And I think just that one trait I don't claim it because, like I said, I didn't do anything. I literally feel like I showed up here with that. I don't, maybe my parents did something. I have no idea, but I've always sort of inherited. My parents didn't have to ask me to study. I
Wow.
knew I was a student. I was in school. I wanted to be good. For sports day, I was running. I wanted to be good at it. Like for some reason, everything I'm doing, I want to do it well. And so my motivation comes from that. It's truly intrinsic. So like I can't let me think of role models. I think role models for me have been in sort of other aspects of life. So for me, the motivation and the desire for growth and continue to expanding and mastery, that's not something that I think came from external. The things that I think I've looked outside of myself for is things like the ability or the desire to really like enjoy every ounce of life. So like that is something I've had role models in. And so like one of the biggest role models I have for that is my grandfather. So he passed a few years ago, but he was a guy who like, he was like tall, not quite as tall as I am, but he was tall. He had a big bellowing voice, a big laugh. He always was the life of the party. And in fact, he just lived his life with an understanding that it should be enjoyed. And so that is not something that I should have showed up with. I had to develop that. And it's a core aspect of my life now. Everything I'm doing, I want to enjoy it. So in addition to it driving towards mastery or me being the best version of myself, I've had to also learn to add on other things. It's like, am I enjoying this? Because at the end of the day, yes, growth is difficult, mastery is difficult. It does require sacrifice. It does require all those things. But at the end of the day, if you don't enjoy that process, it's very difficult to keep it up when things get difficult, and they ultimately always will get difficult. So I've had to learn and role models around really enjoying life. And sort of like, there are quotes that I also try to live by. That there's one that I'm not going to remember fully, but it's really around kind of like, living life in a way where you show up at the end of life, not with your body intact and everything all perfect, but you kind of show up at the end of life skating in sideways and laying like, that was a really good ride. And so like really taking that sort of approach to life, living life from a sense of adventure is kind of, those things is what I've had to learn. And like the role models have been just very widespread, like I said, within my family, or pretty much anybody who I think just does a good job of like taking life by the horns and enjoying the shit out of it. Because at the end of the day, life is short. And that has also been related to my interaction or relationship with dementia. Like I mentioned, my grandmom had dementia. So the way that I also live my life has been influenced by that, because we have no idea what the future holds. We have no idea what we will be when we get old, for example.
Right.
And so all of that is related to kind of how I navigate and how I make those decisions. So the whole benefit or the whole way that I am constantly motivated to keep going is one, mastery. Like I just want to be really good at something. Everything I do, I want to be really good at it. So I'm working as a product manager. I want to be really good at building healthcare technology products. And then the other thing is like having fun and enjoying it. I want to be really good at enjoying the whole journey as well.
Yeah.
And so the motivation comes from that. It's like, work hard, play hard, all of that type of stuff. And I think part of that philosophy comes back to also being able to live life fully. And by that, I mean really sort of like soaking up all of it. And by all of it, I mean the positives and the negatives, the things that will enable negatives. And that kind of like is driven or is almost illustrated by one of my favorite poems ever, which is The Guest House by Rumi. And it's essentially a poem that just talks about life will throw all types of stuff at you. It's important to not only be welcoming to the good things, but also to be welcoming to the things that you might label bad, because they all serve a purpose and they all can guide you along the way. And so bringing in and being open to all of those different types of things leads me to almost feel inspiration from anything.
Right.
Whether it's positive or negative, they all are serving me in order to get me from one place to the next on my journey. And so it's a mix of both intrinsic motivation that I can't claim because I think I showed up here with certain things, as well as me almost like identifying maybe deficiencies or things that I wanted to do more, which is like to really enjoy life and to just be able to dive in. And I think it's basically a managing or melding those two types of both intrinsic and extrinsic motivations and really making sure that they both contribute to ensuring that I'm constantly kind of doing what I want to be doing in life, which is enjoying it and making sure I'm the best version of myself every day.
Solid.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I wanted to highlight in this interview that has nothing to necessarily do with AI machine learning, definitely with the Caribbean. Talk to us about hummingbirds. I was definitely educated. Yeah. I had the experience of I think going to St. Joseph and seeing all the hummingbirds around me. And I didn't see the full bloom, but I could only imagine having so much of them. So tell us, talk to us about that.
I'm glad we went there. So hummingbirds for me, if I remember learning about the concept of spirit animals and really understanding, they're animals that almost help us ground in terms of who we are. And so for me, hummingbirds have always been that. I've always found them to be really, really beautiful. And it was only a few years ago going to Yoret Hummingbird Sanctuary in St. Joseph in Trinidad and learning more about these animals and how amazing they are, both from just a physiological animal kingdom type of position, as well as understanding their sort of spiritual basis or spiritual stature in various indigenous cultures in the Western Hemisphere. And so really understanding and being in awe of these animals, both from a beauty standpoint and from their amazing kind of physiology, how they fly, the way their heart works, all of these things, as well as the fact that they are very much spiritual animals and carry this sort of implication of, transformation and being core to exactly the kind of important aspects of being from the Caribbean. You cannot if you look around Trinidad, for example, hummingbirds are on so many of the emblems, the postal service, it's on the Caribbean Airlines logo, it's everywhere. And it also sort of indicated to me as well the importance of appreciating beauty and appreciating what we have. Trinidad has a ton of birds in general. It's a bird watching paradise, but even the hummingbirds we have, most Trinidadians don't even appreciate it. And I think in a lot of ways, it's kind of a metaphor for, trying as much as possible to understand your gifts and being deeply grateful for it, because people from all over the world come to Trinidad to appreciate things that Trinidadians don't even appreciate about our own island. And so I think it really taught me a lot of those things. And in a lot of ways, I had gone through my entire life liking hummingbirds, but not knowing anything about them in detail. And it was also a metaphor for sort of the things that are just existing around you that could give value to your life that you literally don't even know about. And so I think it also helps me be much more aware of things around me, not just physically, but things might have happened that I may not have valued or looked towards in terms of having value. And so I think the hummingbird aspect, it's something that gives me so much joy and power from the standpoint of it being core Trinidad. So I have hummingbirds all over my apartment. It reminds me of where I come from, but it also constantly reminds me to appreciate the beauty and appreciate the positives and the amazing gifts that we have that we may not ordinarily be appreciative of. So there's a lot of I could keep talking. I could talk for hours on hummingbirds and how amazing they are as a species, but also kind of what they mean to me and why I hold them in such high esteem, and why I actually have a hummingbird tattoo as well, which is not considered the most strong or masculine type of animal, but to me it carries so much power, and they are absolutely amazing animals, at least me personally. And I think more people should appreciate them, especially more people from the Caribbean.
Yeah, and before I met you, I was just like, hummingbird, what's the big deal? And until you actually you went there and you saw them and you saw how fantastic of animals they were, and you saw a number of them, you're like, oh, you had a lot more respect for, I would say, nature and the power of nature. Yeah. Right. So we have 3 more questions. And the first one is, what career tips would you give a high schooler, a person in college, and a professional, in that order?
I think I honestly don't think the advice would be different. Okay. Whether you're in high school, college, career, end of your career, I think to me, there are absolutely certain things that you could apply differently because they are different stages of life. But at the end of the day, the things that I consider most important, and we've kind of touched on them, over the course of this interview so far, but, it's really one, the ability or the importance of knowing yourself well. And that's sort of even in a bigger bucket of just appreciating truth and what's real. And I think there's I think a lot of people generally have probably a lower threshold for truth than they need to. So like being brutally honest with yourself and being okay with that. So like deep self-knowledge, what is true about you, and being okay with that. There is nothing bad or negative necessarily. We all have things within ourselves that are reflected across everybody. And in a lot of ways, the truth is, or one of the truths that I think is actually real, is that anything that we could think of about ourselves applies to other people, whether it's a positive or a negative. And anything we think about somebody else applies to us as well. And so I think that to me is part of understanding and grasping real truth. And that is one aspect of real truth. It is true. If you look at somebody and you admire something in them, you have that as well. And so that truth has driven me and has helped me navigate a ton of different problems, including imposter syndrome, know. And I think when you look at absolute truths as well, another truth that I think most people often don't necessarily have top of mind is that, and this always sounds very cliched, anything is possible. And so I think people tend to hear that and it's like, it's so cliched. It's so like, it's thrown out so much. Oftentimes people may not necessarily grasp how important and true that is. But literally, I do believe in that as being true as well. So like any advice I could give somebody at any stage of their career is that at any point, you can decide to be different. You can decide something else. You can decide a different path, and you have everything at your fingertips to make steps towards whatever direction you choose to go in. So I think a lot of people tend to, just how they may not necessarily know themselves as well as they should, they often don't realize that truth as well, that anything they see or desire or want is absolutely possible, anything. And I think I think most people could acknowledge that as being true intellectually, but I don't think most people live from that
feel
truth.
It and live it.
Feel it exactly in every cell of your body. And I think that's one thing that I hope that my journey alone, just the journey itself, inspires people and shows people, like, because the shifts I have made, it's night and day. When I think about myself starting at Duke Medical School at age 23 to like right now at my age is like completely different. And it's really, I think, recognizing that we are adaptable and we are very plastic in that sense, where anything we decide to do, we can do it. So truth, what is true about you? What is true about yourself? Understand that, accept it, and love it, because it's only with accepting all of it, all of our shortcomings, as well as what we admire about ourselves, is really about admiring and loving all of it, that we can actually grow, feel better about ourselves. And it's real, knowing yourself, and then just understanding that anything is possible. I think those are the two big truths that I think applies to any stage. And then I think the third thing I would say is, like, at the end of the day, it's really, and this is probably coming back to knowing yourself, and also seeing what's possible. But if you know yourself well, then you know what's important. And if you know what's most important, you can make very clear and aligned decisions. So for me, I know exactly, like, if I were to find out that I had 6 moments to live or anything like that, I know that I have lived my life in a way that on my deathbed, or whenever I know that my time on this planet is up, I have lived in a way that I am satisfied and I don't have regrets. And so for me, I think that for me personally, that's around enjoying life and living as much as possible. And so I think if somebody could know themselves very well, then they know what's important, and then you could make decisions very clearly one way or the other. So my career advice to somebody in high school, college, or professional is exactly the same. Know yourself well, understand what's real and what's true, and value that. love all of yourself, and then just understand that anything is possible. And it's really about enjoying the journey, because that's all it really is. It's not about the destination. It's actually about the path.
But the
And
whole
that's just
thing.
kind of like my philosophy. And I try to live with that sense of adventure. I don't believe in leaving anything on the table at the end of life, like use it all up, live fully. In my spiritual aspects, I think that is how we should live. I think the only should that we have in life is to live the shit out of it.
Mm-hmm. And I like that. And I think that should be on a recording for some folks going through medical school or in their PhD, just like kind of enjoy it. And I think a lot of folks tell us that, but that's a skill. So my last question, as we sort of conclude, what are 3 books that you recommend?
Yeah, so books for me have been really, really important. And I think as I think through kind of the things that I have learned along the way, and I've been seeing it in different ways. So in terms of how books I could choose and recommend, so the first one is this book called The 4 Agreements. And so it's basically around 4 tenets of how best to live life. And it's really around, being true to your word, being impeccable with your word, not taking things seriously. And it really drives at that truth aspect. Like, what is real? What is the tenets, the simplest tenets that you could adopt that kind of drives most other decisions? And so like The 4 Agreements was one of those books that really helped me just condense a lot of teachings and learnings all over into sort of just very simple kind of rules to live by, that actually, like, if you do those 4 things, it kind of takes care of pretty much all other problems, or the majority of problems that may come up. So I think that was one. The other book that I definitely recommend is one of my absolute favorites. It's called The Untethered Soul. And so it was written by a guy named Michael Singer, who, his story is absolutely incredible. And his life story, he actually told in another book that he wrote called The Surrender Experiment. But essentially, he was a yogi, and he actually lived his life saying yes to everything. So surrendering to everything. And the journey was so amazing. He ended up actually becoming a software engineer, learning to code, and actually built the world's first medical software, became a billionaire. His story is incredible. And so that basically, the Surrender Experiment is one, but The Untethered Soul really speaks to and sort of helped me look at how our psyche and our mind, our spirit kind of works, in ways that really keep us stuck in places we don't want to be, or in living a life we don't want to live. And so it's a book that I kind of look towards and reread every so often, because it really kind of drives home kind of the absurdity of how we as humans sometimes think and feel about what it means to be human. And so it calls me to really constantly ask a lot of questions, around like what is important, and how we think, and almost like the mental habits, the things that we think over and over that actually don't serve any positive purpose, but it's just like patterns, all this, the monkey brain, the distractions, the negative self-talk, all of that was really, really, really important and really well articulated in that book. And I think finally, the third one, there's a few different ones. I think I'll say 2 more. There's a book called War of Art. And so it was written by Stephen Pressfield. And it's basically a book it's geared towards around how to approach any creative endeavor. So more scope to writers or people like movie directors or people who are doing creative work. But a lot of of it was like, what is required in order to do solid work? And so he talks a lot about this concept called resistance, and what is resistance. And it's really well articulated. If you have a goal, pretty much resistance is anything that comes up that prevents you from achieving a goal, whether you want to write a book, whether you want to get into a particular school. And resistance takes all types of forms: negative self-talk, procrastination, all different things. And the way he broke it down, it just makes you look at when you have a goal and you hear the things that come up that prevent you from doing what you need to do to get to that goal, that's resistance. And so it really helped me break that down. So when I'm having issues, or things that happen, I have a way to understand and break that down. And then finally, I think the book that I would sort of also recommend is a book that was very, very practical and helped me really move away or understand the importance of developing skills as opposed to just following passions. And passion is super important, like I mentioned, because it helps you get past those difficult periods. But there's a book called So Good They Can't
Ignore You.
Love that
Cal
book. And so I
Newport.
read that in med school, and that really had me like rethink all the things I was doing. I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. Like, what are the skills? Like, what do you really want to do? And what are the skills that are necessary in order to you to have that impact? And because of that book, because of that book, I was able to actually decide to abandon that sort of like clinical path, because I realized like that was just a train I was on. It wasn't something I had chosen. And that's when I started to really ask questions around, okay, what impact do I want to have advancing the edge of what's possible in medicine? So what skills do I need to develop in order to have that impact? And that has been the path I've been on ever since. It's about developing those skills. And now I have a certain amount of skills, a combination of skills that can be leveraged to solve the problems that a company is willing to pay me to solve. And so it's really all about those skills. So I think those are the books that I would recommend. I mean, there are tons of others. But I think for this discussion, I think those are the books that I think really helped me understand and develop the sort of clarity around some of these things that I've been able to use to essentially get from where I was to where I am today.
Appreciate it. And, this to me was a very fulfilling interview simply because I think the medical field itself is a path to freedom. It's a path to a better life for many people across the world.
Yeah.
And I think many people take that path because that's sometimes the only option. But I think you've articulated through your story and, all of the perseverance of bad mind that
exactly
it is, it's not the only way. And I hope that folks, keep that expanded perspective about all the different things that you can do and focus on the problems to solve versus more so I want to be a doctor type thing, right? So
exactly.
Thank you very much for your time and, definitely appreciate it. And we'll have another one soon.
Yeah, same.
Take care.
Same. This was fun. All right. See you, Mark.